Good afternoon and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater. My name is Richard Hunt. I'm the director of the Center for Legislative Archives, which houses the historic records of the House and Senate from 1789 to the present, and I've been asked to stand in for David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States. We're pleased that you could join us today, whether you're here in the theater or joining us through Facebook or YouTube. Before we hear from Stephen Hess about his new book, Bit Player, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs in this theater. Tomorrow, December 5th, as you know, the nation will observe a national day of mourning to mark the passing of President George H.W. Bush. Therefore, the noon screenings of Earthrise and Debrief Apollo 8 have been rescheduled for noon on Friday, December 14th. On Thursday, December 6th, at 7 p.m., please join us for a panel discussion, Women and the Vote, Opposition to Women's Equality from Suffrage to ERA. 2019 marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment and the opening of our Rightfully Hers exhibit here at the National Archives in March. The panel on Thursday explores how the feminist movement has been shaped and changed by the systems, institutions, and individuals who are working against women's equality. To find out more about these and other programs at the National Archives, please check our website, archives.gov, or sign up at the tables outside the theater to get email updates. One way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its outreach and education programs. You can visit its website at archivesfoundation.org to learn more about the foundation's programs. Now on to today's event. Stephen Hess, the author of numerous award-winning books on politics, the presidency, and the media, is one of the foremost authorities on government and media in the United States. Mr. Hess is a senior fellow emeritus in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. He first joined Brookings in 1972 and was also the distinguished research professor of media and public affairs at the George Washington University from 2004 to 2009. He also served on the White House staff during the Eisenhower and Nixon presidencies and as an advisor to Presidents Ford and Carter. At different points in his career, Hess has concurrently served as a fellow in the Faculty of Government at Harvard University, a United States representative to the United Nations General Assembly, and the UNESCO General Conference. Prior to joining Brookings, he was the national chairman of the White House Conference on Children and Youth from 1969 to 1971 and was a deputy assistant to the president for urban affairs in 1969. Chuck Todd is the NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, the longest-running show in television history and the #1 most-watched Sunday public affairs program for the 2016-2017 season. Prior to taking the helm at Meet the Press in September 2014, Mr. Todd served as NBC News chief White House correspondent, traveling the world covering President Obama. From 2010 to 2014, Mr. Todd also hosted MSNBC's The Daily Rundown. He was named by GQ the most powerful journalist in Washington in January 2012 as part of the magazine's 50 Most Powerful People in Washington. In 2009, Mr. Todd co-authored the definitive election result analysis book for the 2008 presidential campaign titled How Barack Obama Won. His second book is The Stranger, Barack Obama in the White House. Prior to joining NBC News, Mr. Todd worked at the National Journal's Hotline for 15 years, serving for 6 of those years as the editor-in-chief. Ladies and gentlemen, let's please welcome Stephen Hess and Chuck Todd to the National Archives.
All right.
You want to sit here? I'll
Yeah,
sit there.
you got it. Good afternoon. Happy lunchtime. I have to say, I find this to be a treat. As somebody who read a lot of Mr. Hess's books, and I've been on a few receiving ends of research calls from him back in the day, but I have to admit this is just kind of a treat. So I don't know if you're going to enjoy the conversation, but I am. So there. Let me start with something before we get into some specifics on your years with Eisenhower, Nixon, watching, and I actually wanted to talk to you a little bit about President Bush. Let me just ask a basic question here. Are you a political scientist, historian, author who did a interlude into government service? Or are you, how would you describe your career? You've had different phases. Are you an historian who accidentally ended up in public service? Are you a public servant who accidentally became an historian? A little bit of all of it.
Yeah, as the book starts, I'm a young man getting off a troop ship, coming back from Germany, where I had been drafted and served 2 years. 1958, I rose from private to private first class. I used to tell my students I was then replaced by Elvis Presley, which was almost true. His unit replaced my unit. I didn't replace him. And there I was, 25 years old and unemployed. So I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a historian. I'm 25 years old. And what I didn't know was that my mentor from Johns Hopkins, Malcolm Moose, had just been appointed the speechwriter to Eisenhower. So a month later, I was speechwriter to Eisenhower. And my students later would say, how do you get to be a speechwriter to the president when you're 25? And your answer is, be very nice to your professors. So I was,
a mentor of mine was a TA for Henry Kissinger, and that's how he got his first job on the Rockefeller presidential campaign, by the way, not Nixon.
Yeah.
But,
so, but I wasn't trained to be a speechwriter. I was just a person who was pretty good with words. My professor knew that, felt it, and it was sort of a strange moment because those old enough to remember, I don't see any. It was the moment when Sherman Adams, the chief of staff to the president, was
really the first first person who sort of defined the job. Right?
Yeah, that's right. And he was being pushed out in a scandal. And Mac Moose said, asked him if he could have an assistant. Sherman Adams, being Sherman Adams, said, of course not. Mac Moose, my professor of political science at Johns Hopkins, also happened to be the chairman of the Republican Party in Baltimore. So he knew a bit about politics. He did an end run about Sherman Adams, went to the chairman of the Republican National Committee, his name was Meade Alcorn, and said, well, I need somebody to help me on the president's speeches in this very important midterm election. Don't you think you should pay for it? And Alcorn said, oh, sure. So they sent me over to see him. And Alcorn said, how much you want? First time anybody asked me that. They didn't, when I became a private in the Army, nobody said, how much do I want? And I said, I didn't know why. I said $1,000 a month. He said, okay. Oh my, I must have asked for too little. Yeah. So I said, well, there'll be other expenses. I had no idea what that meant. And he said, oh, well, we'll give you an apartment in Georgetown. I said, boy, I'm good at this negotiating stuff. So I said, well, I'd like a 4-month contract to get to the end of the year. Okay. So it's different when you sort of start at the top like that.
Your first campaign ends up in a presidential. And you work for a president.
Yeah, all of that was involved. And what was I? So going fast forward, I had now worked for a second president and indeed a third. But that's not what I really want to do. I just got there by accident.
What did you want to do? What did you think you were going to do?
I wanted to write books, that's all.
That's what you wanted to do?
I wanted to write books. So I had now made enough money that I could spend a few years, my family wouldn't suffer, and I could just write books. Let me say how I made enough money, which was unusual. Even you may not remember. In those days, an ex-president didn't get all of the things that ex-presidents now get: staff, office space, cars, security. Eisenhower had just gotten his old Chrysler, went 80 miles back home to Gettysburg. Secret Service had trailed him. When they got to Gettysburg, the Secret Service did a U-turn and came back, and there he was, all alone in Gettysburg.
Just Ike and Mamie.
Just Ike and Mamie. The university gave him, College of Gettysburg gave him rooms so he could write his, and it was a man named Bryce Harlow, who was really the go-to man for all things Republican in Washington. And he came to me at that point and said, well, we, the Republican National Committee, to keep Eisenhower alive politically for our purposes, somebody has to answer his mail. Would you be interested? Sure, why not?
I have to say that has to be a cool job. I've always thought the coolest thing to do is work for an ex-president. Better than a sitting president. What's more fun?
But of course, what did we didn't know how much mail that we just wrote a contract, $3 a letter. We didn't know that Eisenhower was the most beloved man in the world, and we were overwhelmed. Well,
he did save the world, but you know.
But at any rate, all this money came in, and now ultimately I was going to have enough money to write these books. But to answer your question, so I started to write the book. And the first book I wrote was called America's Political Dynasty. It's got a big full third page in the New York Times, had a Columbia University professor, history professor, write in, gave me a good review, and he says, Stephen Hess, a freelancer. And I was immediately wiped out. Here I was trying to write a book. I had a pad. All I was a free. So I kept writing books, and they had to figure out what to call me. So that's, from freelancer, I became a historian. From historian, I became a political scientist. I didn't change in any way, but they had to have a title for me.
I've joked, like, when do you become author? Historian is another promotion, right?
Absolutely.
Right, from just plain old author.
Absolutely. So that is the way. Now, all of this time, I would really have loved to have been at the Brookings Institution. That's where you have real writers, real friends. But I didn't have a PhD. I was just somebody who got off a boat with my bachelor's degree. But now, over time, I had become an author and a political scientist and so forth and so on. And another thing that had happened at Brookings, which was this was in 1972 when I joined Brookings. Brookings, actually, most people don't know this, during the New Deal and the Fair Deal was a right-wing operation. And Kermit Gordon came in, and he had been president on the President Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors, and then Johnson took over, and he was budget director, and Johnson said, would you like to be Secretary of the Treasury? He said, no, I'd like to be the chairman, I'd like to be the president of Brookings. So he went to Brookings, and when Nixon came in and all these Democrats had to leave, they came to Brookings. Charlie Schultz, Alice Rivlin, Art Oken.
So that's really when Brookings became sort of the out-of-power home for Democrats?
Exactly. And there I was, and suddenly the fact that I was a Republican, I think, he never said, was very useful. Sure. That all these Democrats, let's pick up a Republican, particularly one who's a moderate Republican to begin with. So they were very happy to have me.
Speaking of moderate Republicans, we are in the midst of mourning President George Herbert Walker Bush. And what's interesting to me is, if you were to, you've done this, I think, I'd argue, is that you've done the family trees of Republican politics, right? And what's interesting to me about H.W. is how he tried to straddle both, you could argue, I guess, in this case, let's use your two presidents, the Eisenhower line and the Nixon line, right? And H.W., I mean, literally, even with his Supreme Court picks, one was a New England moderate, one was the Southern conservative. Everything was about, so where does he fall, and is the Eisenhower line dead now? Essentially, is this line ended in the modern era of the Republican Party with
dead?
Yeah,
dead. Yeah, when I was an active politician and a Republican, we were comfortably a third of the party, enough to have a difference. We had the New England, the New England senators were Republican. The West Coast senators were Republican.
Both moderates, very moderates,
yeah.
and moderates for different reasons.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
In the middle, you had the Midwest conservative Republicans who control the party. In the South was racist Democrats. They weren't Republicans at all at that point. But enough so that we were listened to, and we were worthy, and we could make a difference. And then you see what happened over time. And the real turning point to me in terms of rough and ready would have been Newt Gingrich and Barry Goldwater. They were different folks, and I've had I say a Republican because I don't know what else to be, but occasionally I vote Republican. Sometimes I don't. They call me a rhino. What is that? A Republican in name only. But that's about where I am today. Of course, you want to go into the question of Trump. That's another story.
No. But let me go back to Eisenhower, and I want to go back to the president you know best in particular. Was he a partisan? I mean, I feel like that if we ever were to say we had two presidents who didn't seem ideological when you look at them, one would be George Washington, our founder. Okay, you set him aside. The only other one that comes close to me, at least in the modern definition of independent potentially, is Eisenhower. Is that fair?
You know, let me go back a step and say, while I think that's fair, it is also true that Eisenhower was a great politician.
Do you think we've underrated him? History underrated him over time?
I think he was very clever to be presented as an anti-politician because he was a great politician. And the strange part about it, of course, 1952, the ticket of Eisenhower and Nixon, that was to twin a politician, a non-politician with a politician. Nixon was a bad politician. He was not a good politician.
He won a lot of races for a bad politician.
Yeah, well, but it was a very strange combination. The question about Eisenhower was truly a moderate, a centrist. If you go back, everybody should go back and read the famous State of the Union, the famous farewell address, the industrial military complex, which people talk about that, but as you read it, it's really, the word that comes is balance. Eisenhower was a person who wanted things to be balanced. Government should be balanced with non-government. States should be balanced with the national, and so forth and so on. That was pure Eisenhower. He was a Midwesterner, so he had a certain conservative orientation, but he was an internationalist from his years in the military, so that he combined these two features. He was a very interesting man.
With Richard Nixon, who was he? And I say this in this respect.
Yeah.
I think Nixon would have been whatever it took. If it meant to be a moderate to win, he'd have been a moderate. If it would have meant to be a Democrat to win, he'd have been a Democrat.
Yeah, there's something to be said to that. Nixon, when I did not know Nixon, even though I was in the Eisenhower White House, till he left, the administration was over, because Nixon was not somebody who was around the White House. That really started when Jimmy Carter brought Mondale over and gave him an office. Nixon had no office in the White House. I never saw him, except he would come in for National Security Council meetings and so I didn't know him.
How did you get connected to him?
Okay. That same man, Bryce Harlow, who said write letters for Eisenhower, said, oh, by the way, if you can do anything nice for Richard Nixon, he's going to California, he's going to be a rainmaker in a big firm, and he has nobody in Washington, and so forth. So Nixon, so I was making all of this money for doing virtually nothing. I said, I better.
For basically answering mail for Eisenhower Nixon?
And I had one of maybe Eisenhower's secretaries really answering the mail. All I had to do was write a little book. Here's a Q&A. This is how you answer that letter, and so forth. So I just thought I should do something else for Ike and Dick. So I did two things. Whenever I would see a letter, or whenever I would see an article, and I said, he knows him. And he's getting married, or his child is getting married, or he's getting out of.
So you started helping them with those little
so I wrote
flourishes. Hey, congratulations!
Right. Exactly. I did that, and sent one to Gettysburg, one to Los Angeles, and around Washington. I would hear all these people say, I got the nicest note from the general. Eisenhower, after he left the presidency, wanted to be the general, known as the general. Never heard anything about Nixon. The second thing I did was I would send them sort of a newsletter with an audience of 2. You know, anything that sort of I thought would interest them.
So you put together a newsletter for them?
Yeah, of sorts. And Nixon loved this.
Do you have these still?
No.
Oh my gosh.
Oh,
they're nowhere? They're nowhere in the house? His wife's right here. Those, I would love to see these newsletters.
Well, they just look like letters.
The Eisenhower-Nixon personalized political newsletters by Stephen Hess.
Nixon loved them because he had been in Washington since he left the Navy.
He loved gossip. Did you put a little gossip in there?
And it was all the gossip. You know, he went to California, and that was the California gossip. He had no interest in that. He once said to me, if I have to play golf one more time with Randy Scott, remember the old cowboy star Randy? I will go out of my mind. So he liked that. But the letters, when I first met him, he said, oh, by the way, don't send me those letters. I don't want to be remembered as someone who remembers people's birthday. Nixon was always doing something odd for me, against the image that I had otherwise of him. He was so interesting in that regard. So we started to help him on Saturday Evening Post articles. And it's typical. Saturday Post article might pay $10,000, which would be about $50,000 today.
Wow.
And
a year? That was annual.
For an article, you know, big article by the former vice president and all of that.
A $10,000?
Yeah, they would pay $10,000
for one piece.
Yeah, big piece.
Wow.
and
that's good money even now.
I had no contract with Nixon, never did, and he would often split the fee with me. If I wrote it myself, I'd get $1,000, and I'd say, Dick, you're paying me too much, and he'd be embarrassed. And he said, oh, I just have to give it to the IRS. So remember, he was supposed to be cheap. All of these things.
Well, he was just keeping it from the IRS. Yeah, that's what he was.
So Nixon was a big surprise. But to sort of get back to what you're saying, he could be one way or he could be another. I finally was on Nixon's White House staff. 9 years later, I came back.
Right.
And what I was a deputy assistant to the president for urban affairs. Basically, I was Pat Moynihan's chief of staff. And he had a liberal group in the White House. He had a conservative group in the White House. He had a comparable person on the conservative side named Arthur Burns. So our struggles, and they were really serious, good struggles, were between a Harvard professor, Moynihan, sociologist, the liberal, and a Columbia professor, an economist, Burns. And these were wonderful fights. Like you wanted...
The good type of fights.
You wanted to be in the White House. And you never knew where you... And Moynihan, the biggest one, Moynihan won. So, and I would say to Moynihan, because I felt myself as sort of the bench coach for him, I say, watch, if he swings right, Supreme Court Justice, we're next. Move in quickly, we're next. And he'll swing left on that, because he was a centrist by averaging. You know, he moved right, he moved left, and he cut it down.
And his
to the middle.
goal was, I would say this, his goal was, he was always looking to have the biggest group of people like him, right? I mean, meaning that is why he tried to go back and forth, isn't it? He seemed to care so much about what people thought of him.
I guess so. I never put it in those terms, but again, he was constantly surprising. When I got to California, he was running for governor.
Okay.
Bad mistake. He shouldn't have run for governor. And his big issue was he was against the John Birch Society, which was the real extreme right wing. And his opponent in the primary, Joe Show, was for it. This was the issue of the campaign.
And this was percolating in a lot of Republican primaries
but
in that
he
era.
felt so strongly about it that he was against the John Birch Society. Of course he would be. But he was against anybody who was for it, including two rather powerful Republican House members who automatically were against him, and they were friends of his. And I think he felt so strongly because they had so viciously attacked Eisenhower. And he felt That bothered him. And I can remember we were going out to dinner one night in his law office in L.A., and he had a private bathroom, and he was shaving his head. We remember what a beard he had. He would shave before we were going out for dinner. The door was open. He was looking in the mirror, and he said, otherwise, I couldn't look in the mirror. And I thought maybe he's saying this for my sake. And I thought, no, that's ridiculous. He doesn't need to say it for my sake. He's saying it to himself. And by the way, Ronald Reagan, who when he ran, he was a much better politician. He said, I'm against the John Birch Society, but the rest of the people do whatever you want. But Nixon couldn't do that. So I don't know how to define Nixon.
Did you, do you like him?
Yes, he was wonderful to work with. You know, when I wrote for Eisenhower in the White House, I was really basically part of the process. It all went through other people. In the book, I show that I wrote a lot of these speeches, but I didn't sit there with him.
You didn't get to sit with him.
Exactly.
With Nixon's different.
Nixon was different, right? So Nixon, I worked with, and I liked his mind, and he was very, very smart. So I liked that. And again, he always said the right thing for me. I wrote a book, a biography of Nixon with Earl Mazo. Mm-hmm. Earl Mazo was the chief Washington correspondent for the Herald Tribune. He had written a Nixon biography in 1959, which was very favorable, did very well. In 1967, he wasn't in a position to, so I took over, so it became Mazo and Hess. That book, Mazo, at the end of the 1960 election, went out to find out if the election, Kennedy-Nixon, was stolen. He went into Texas and he went into Illinois, and he did a lot of research, and he had plenty of evidence from both Texas and Chicago. And he started to write the articles, and he got a call from Nixon. This is all in the book. And Nixon said, those are interesting articles. I'd appreciate it if you'd stop writing them. And he said, nobody steals the presidency, he said. And he explained that a president has to deal with all these figures throughout the world. It can't be stolen. And Earl was shocked, and he stops the articles. When the book comes out, all of this is in the book, and people are sort of shocked. The Herald Tribune has an editorial, 1,200 words editorial about what a remarkable guy Richard Nixon is. But again, this is the Richard Nixon who, to me, when I got there, was sort of a Herblock cartoon. And now we fill in the blanks. And it becomes complicated because of Watergate, and then that's a large part of the book.
Well, I was just going to say, when did you come to get your, have you made your peace with Nixon?
I haven't. I haven't to this day. When Watergate happened, I was now no longer there. I was at Brookings, but I had only been there recently. Mm-hmm. I knew all these people. Some of them were even friends of mine. The issue was, what did Nixon know? I had to assume, from where I'm going, that he didn't know anything about it. I even gave a speech at the Harvard.
From what you saw, you really believed he wouldn't have known.
I gave a speech, and I didn't know, but in which about 4 ways that he would not have known, if you're President of the United States, that this was going on. President of the United States don't deal with people breaking into the Democratic headquarters. So I thought. The tapes came out finally, and I realized that I was wrong on every one, dead wrong. And at that point, while the networks, 3 networks, were doing the Senate hearings, PBS put together Jim Lehrer and Robin McNeil. And it became very big because the networks quickly worked on a schedule where only one had to handle it so the other 2 could go out and make money. And McNeil and Lehrer, who were new at this, they had 2 end men. They had a lawyer on one side of them who kept changing for the legal issues, and I did the politics on the other side. And I sat there night after night, day after day, listening to this. And finally, I had headaches. I couldn't sleep.
Wow. And
I literally resigned on the air. I'm not coming back tomorrow. And it's in the book what I said and all of that. And I worried after that, as I started writing, what about all of these other people? I mean, Nixon was surrounded by people who were middle class, upper middle class people who went to University of Southern California, who went to Williams, who went to Brown. How were they in Nixon's web? And so I looked at them, and some, well, I called him in his chief of staff, had sort of spent his life dedicated to him. That was sort of obvious. His wife even wrote a memoir later saying how she thought she was going to lose him to Richard Nixon. Others, like Charles Colson, were ruthless, absolutely ruthless. You knew exactly why he was there and why he wanted to be there. Others tended to be young people. The commander-in-chief sent them to do something, and they did it. The saddest part of that group was a young man named Bud Krogh, who was told to lead something called the Plumbers, to break into Ellsworth's psychiatrist's office. And of course they got caught, and he went to prison. A young lawyer from Seattle. He went after that to San Clemente to see Nixon, to tell him he still loved him, he appreciated him. And Nixon said, "I didn't do anything wrong." And Krogh turned around and walked out and wrote a desperate little book about it. So could I make my peace with Nixon? Who had been,
You're struggling with it because of everybody else's lives that were destroyed.
Well, other people. Pat Moynihan said to me, he's now a senator. He said, "Look, you have to have closure. We'll go to New Jersey. We'll have lunch with him." And I was okay. Before that happened, Nixon wrote his memoirs, R.N., in which he admitted nothing.
Right.
He said he was sorry. That was good enough for David Frost, who made a good living on changing "I'm sorry" into something else. Beth and I.
You're not impressed with Mr.
Yeah,
Frost.
Beth and I were at the Arena stage one night, and intermission. There was Bill Safire, who had been importantly on Nixon's staff, and his wife Helene. At intermission, I said to them, "Hey, what does this mean? I got a book from RN today." And Helene says, "It means he's forgiven you." So I never even went to.
What did you do wrong?
I never even went to his funeral, which is terrible. I worry about this. Instead, I did the analysis for C-SPAN. So this is what happens when you write a memoir. You have to relive this, rethink, did you do right, did you wrong, should I have done this, and so forth. Everybody should write their memoirs. You don't have to be an assistant to a president to learn more about yourself.
You know, the Nixon Library now is supposedly trying to enhance the Watergate coverage a little bit, more and be a little more a more honest portrayal. What do you make of it?
I haven't been there recently. I don't know. When I left the White House, I gathered up all my papers. I put them in a closet at Brookings. I didn't know what to do with them. Finally, Brookings wanted its closet back. So I asked Bill Safire, "What did you do with your papers?" And he said, "Oh, I gave them to the Library of Congress." And he gave me the name of the person. I went over there and decided to give my papers. Or really, at that point, they told me, "You're not giving your papers. You're lending your papers." Why? You can have my papers. No, at that point, Schlesinger and who was the other big Kennedy writer, Sorensen, had given their papers to the government and had received tax credits for it so that they didn't have to pay their taxes for the rest of their lives. And so I was to lend.
That's a pretty good deal.
It was a good deal. They've changed the law now.
Did you get this deal?
I got the deal, but I changed the deal to go back to
So you're paying, what you're saying is you have paid a couple dollars in taxes over the years?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
IRS might be outside. Yeah.
So I don't know. I gave my papers, and sort of that was the end of my Nixon.
Was it a period for you when you did it?
Yes, that was it. And then it all came back together when I decided to write my memoirs. But I was very lucky because my papers in the Library of Congress, you know, anybody can have them. I could see them anything I wanted. So that was a big help if you're planning to write your memoirs.
You spent a lot of time studying the intersection between government and the media, and the back and forth. Look, you've seen it change from what it was to what it is now. You've seen this transition. What hasn't changed?
Well, what I did, when I went to Brookings, as obvious, I was going to write about the presidency. I'm not a theorist. I was trying to write how the presidency can be
Write what
better.
you know, right? You write about what you know.
So I did that, and that did very well, very well. And then I thought, I'm not going to spend, as academics always do, spend all of my life just doing the same thing, because by now you go to fancy conferences, you give keynote addresses and so forth. I was looking for something else to write about. And the one thing that interested me, that I knew nothing about, was the media, called the press at that time, now the media. And so I got fascinated by you guys. I did a series of books called Newswork. There were actually seven of them. And it was to try to better understand reporters and journalists. Try to answer your question, I don't think they've changed. I'm not. You may say that they're better, they're worse, but they're the same people who are looking for journalism and for a life in journalism in the same sort of way. Now, you can answer the question far better than I, how the system changed, of which you became a very prominent part as the internet took over.
What I find fascinating is we talk about the revolving door. And the revolving door is not a new phenomenon. If anything, it's just a recurring phenomenon. There's been a lot of people that have gone back and forth between sort of government service, covering it. I put you in a different category. You're sort of, you didn't quite go, you skipped journalism and went right to authorship, right? You went right.
Excuse me, I didn't quite. One time I decided to have a column.
Okay.
And it was sort of applied research, applied government sort of a column. Mm-hmm. And I discovered something that I wish more columnists could discover. I only had 100 ideas. By the time I wrote the 101st column, I realized I was repeating myself, and I stopped my column.
David Brooks. David Brooks, it's funny you say this, and good for you. David Brooks said it was the single hardest thing when he had to go to 3 days a week at the New York Times. It's like, you have one good idea a week.
Yeah.
And you have to come up with 3 of them. Bill Sapphire, I heard, used to complain about this. Yeah. That, you just sort of run out of ideas, and nobody knows when to stop.
Yeah.
So what should the relationship be between the press and the presidency?
Well, it's a standoff relationship in a sense. I remember the best press secretary, somebody like Jim Haggerty, he said, I knew who I was working for. I was working for the press. I was working for the President of the United States. I hope, and I was honest, I could give the press information that I thought that they should have, but we didn't cross the line. It's gotten increasingly sloppy in that regard. I don't know how many press secretaries today would make a statement like that. The amount of, when you talk about crossing the line, it involves leaking.
Mm-hmm. You went through the stages of leaking. I love this. You have different ways that you identify the type of leakers. The ego leaker who wants to make themselves look good.
Right.
Obviously a whistleblower is one thing. Go through them. What are your...
Oh, my goodness. Oh, I forgot. You read some of the earlier books.
No. We do real research here at the press. Come on now.
Yeah, I did a topology of leakers at one time. Why people...
You classify different people.
Yeah.
I love this.
And most of the biggest leakers were sort of ego leakers. They're just people who wanted to show that they had something that the reporter didn't have, and they
That's
could
my favorite leaker, by the way. The best sources for me are the ones who you play to their ego.
Yeah.
Well, you're in the room for this stuff.
Yeah.
You're part of the decision-making process. Trust me, it doesn't take that much to puff up these people.
Yeah. I remember, but I crossed the line from government, and government is entitled to have secrets. It's important to do your business in that way. When I see, as I do now, the FBI, for example, said this morning, this came of an FBI leak. And I was sort of shocked. The FBI shouldn't be leaking anything. That's you know,
the
and
FBI
so forth.
was founded by a leaker.
So at any rate, I think I don't know how, knowing that I'm unhappy with the way it is now,
right.
I don't know how much I can blame on the President of the United States, how much I can blame on the people he's brought in with him, how much I can blame on any change that you may see in the system. Well, I should say I wrote this book because I did not choose, as I had done for all those years, to spend my life answering reporters' questions about the presidency when I wasn't going to be able to say anything good about this president, and I was going to be more involved in being angry,
right.
more involved, and so forth. And so what do I do if I'm a presidency scholar who chooses not to write about the presidency? Well, people said, go and write your memoirs, which I didn't want to do because memoirs are supposed to be from generals who have big wars. And one of my colleagues said, oh, no, you know, I called it bit player. He said, no, there are more bit players than there are generals. You'll see.
I think it was a brilliant title. We've got a couple microphones here. If you guys have some questions, all I would ask for is you ask the question into the microphone because we have people watching on the internet, so they get this. So feel free to line up on either side of the room. Yes, sir. We got just a couple minutes.
Sure. David Balducci. At a press conference, I remember reading about is that Eisenhower, when asked to assess the contributions of Nixon, said that if you give him a week, he'd think of something.
Yep.
Sir, do you know the backstory on that?
Oh, sure. It's all in my book.
Would you tell us about that?
No, read the book. No, I'll tell you this. At that time, the president gave his press conference almost every week. He was serious about that. It was an obligation he had. He gave it in the Indian Treaty Room in what's now the Eisenhower Executive Office. And it was recorded, but it was not played on till that evening on the air. So all of us could listen to the tape in the White House mess in our dining room and hear what he had to say. So I can remember very clearly listening to that. Give me a week and I'll think about it. And sort of shocked by it. Nobody said anything, but I didn't understand it. The next day, I asked John Eisenhower, his son, was on the White House staff as assistant cabinet officer. Very good guy, a very smart guy. And I said, what could the president have meant by that? And he said, this was like the president wanted to get out of there in a half hour. That's the way he usually did it. And according to John, this would sort of be toward the last question, and what he was supposedly saying, and Eisenhower got things often a little confused in those press conferences. He said, I'll be back next week and give you the answer to that. I thought about that, and it was not a good answer, really. And I worried about, and by the way, the press didn't come back in a week. This was, to my way, the most destructive thing that had been said about Nixon in that period. Because remember, Nixon was supposed to be the candidate of experience. Kennedy was not, and he had pulled the experience right out from under him with that statement. And thinking about it, he said something mean. He said something mean about a man who had been...
Did he mean to?
I don't think so, but he said something, I can't tell you whether he meant it, but he said something mean about a man who had been his loyal assistant for 8 years. Now, during the campaign, we, Mac and I, were ready to go. We had the speeches ready and so forth, and Eisenhower didn't go. And we didn't know why, and we couldn't figure out why, but he didn't do anything until a few speeches at the end. In our book, the Hess book, we explain that Mamie Eisenhower and the president's doctor came to Nixon and said, we're worried about his health. Please don't go ask him to give all those speeches. Eisenhower was very upset about this. He wanted to give those speeches, and by the way, he wanted Kennedy defeated. So
he knew that his legacy was on the line in 16 as much as Nixon, right?
I don't know if he knew that, but he knew that if he had given some speeches, remember how close this election was. You talk about things that changed the election, and everybody has a theory of what changed. Right. But Eisenhower giving some appropriate speeches in appropriate places could have made the difference. And he didn't, and he later said something about it was the biggest error of his life.
Did Ike like Nixon? That's always been a mystery.
I could not swear to that. Eisenhower was a person whose friends were within a 10-year radius of him. He had a set group of friends.
And he stuck to him, huh?
That he stuck. Nixon was never a friend of his in that way. But he did want him to be I've discussed this with John Eisenhower too. Of the people who could have been a successful candidate, he wanted Nixon. He wanted a man named Bob Anderson, who was a Secretary of Treasury, if he could have had just anybody in the world. Gotcha. But given that, as John Eisenhower, he said to him many times, he wanted Nixon.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I worked in the domestic policy staff for President George Herbert Walker Bush, and good time for appraising his presidency this week. One thing I was very interested in, having experienced it, Bill Sapphire wrote a big piece in the New York Times about, during the election season of '92, how he thought Bush was very fearful of Gingrich and that group in Congress. And I kind of experienced that with some of the policy issues I worked on. So your appraisal of the going back on the tax pledge and what he did afterwards, how that hurt him.
This is in terms of Eisenhower?
No, Bush. The tax pledge and Gingrich.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. He's talking about when Bush rescinded the tax pledge, the launching of Gingrich.
Oh, well,
the
it
fear
sure
of
hurt. You've heard Bush tell you how much it hurt. And you know, the funny part about speechwriters is most they write is what we call rose garden rubbish. It doesn't amount to very much. I mean, the speeches that I write about, that I wrote, that are in the book, were there for a specific reason. But boy, Peggy Noonan wrote one that really hurt. Read my lips, and it hurt. It was phrased in such a way that it had a natural response. But I can't tell you what.
God, I didn't realize Peggy wrote that speech.
Wasn't it Peggy?
I don't know. I didn't realize that Peggy wrote that '88 speech. I got to look that up. I have her on the show site.
Okay.
Yeah, she did write the nomination speech. But you know, other people may have had a hand in that specific phrase.
Oh, I don't know. I'll ask her.
I think before we'll go one more question here. Yeah, and I wanted to get.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Specifically, I guess, what would you describe from back then for that period? You write a speech, the president says, okay. Is there a group around that censors that? And why I'm asking that is, in today's age, if you were to start your career today with Twitter and Facebook and email and all the electronic aspects that kind of float through the system, how would you manage that if you were doing that versus how things were managed back then, if that makes sense?
The speechwriters, at least in my day, would have nothing to do with managing that. I mean, put it this way, Eisenhower had a staff where everybody knew why they were there, knew their responsibilities. We didn't get into press relations. We didn't get into media things.
Was it expected you had to stay in your lane?
That's right. You stay in your lane. And interesting, it was a few things I should say. Just it was a tiny staff. You would not believe that in the 8 years that he was in the office, looking at the A list for the White House messes, and putting aside military aides, there were only 81 people in that 8 years. The mess was very important to us because it was the place that we could mix, since we weren't otherwise talking about what we were doing. And it was a staff that was incredibly devoted to the president. No speechwriter would dare to say something like, go out and say, I wrote that line, as speechwriters simply.
They do it now all the time.
That's right. We would never say that. That would be infra-dig. It was not anything that we would do. Let me just say something about those times. Those 81 people, 3 were women. 3 women, 81 people.
I assume everybody was white.
President's secretary, Mamie's secretary, 1 black. And that black, he had a good job. And every time it was in the paper, it was saying he was the first black who was in a professional job at the White House. What a different world. You know, everybody is unhappy right now with, they want to move faster, and I want them to move faster. But boy, oh boy, if my grandchildren could really, maybe they could realize, understand how far we had come from that. One other story about it, that shows how far we came. Tiny staff, so that I did get invited to things like state dinners, which no young man would get invited to today. Bought my white tie, paid $37 for it at a going out sale. Went to state dinner for the Prince of Japan. What was the one who would about to be, who's now the
honorary emperor.
The emperor, yeah. And I was invited, I'm pretty sure, to that dinner because we were the same age, 26 years old. So they were trying to say, see, we have somebody young too. We got to this dinner, my wife and I, and our tails. We found out that the dinner was sort of an evening with Gershwin. Very nice program, part of which was Porgy and Bess, to which they had Todd Duncan, the original Porgy, and Camellia Williams, the first great opera singer, black opera singer who was in American opera houses. And when you get in, they tell you who your dinner partner is going to be, the people you walk in with, the people you sit with. And my wife and I had them as our partners. And we were thrilled. The most interesting people there. And at this point, the social secretary comes up to me and pulls me aside and apologizes to me for putting us in with the black entertainers. That's the world of 1960.
Thank you very much.
Wow, what a story. Before I go, Beth has, your wife has a little bit of a role in the memoir, right? She's a bit player and bit player?
She's one.
More than a bit player. How much did she remember that you forgot?
Yeah, the book is divided into Eisenhower, Nixon, Brookings, and Beth. And it's invited into Beth because it starts with, I was invited to give a talk on a Cunard Line ship. It was going up the coast of Alaska and so forth. And for this beautiful suite that we were given, all I had to do was give 2 speeches. One on the media, one on the presidency. I had a good deal. So I give my presidency speech, and I looked to my wife for confirmation. And she said, why didn't you tell that story? How about that other one? This is what longstanding wives know. And I said, make a list. So I came back the next day, and I said, I've changed. My new lecture will be called Beth's List. Beth claims that half of the audience walked out. She's wrong. There's only a few people. But it was I used that as the opportunity to tell stories, sort of people who passed through my life, like dancing with Jacqueline Kennedy, or helping Ruth Bader Ginsburg get the nomination, or having dinner with Porgy and Bess. Well, that's right. Or talking photography with Richard Avedon, and I didn't even have a camera, or meeting the. It's like that. So it was an opportunity.
The Forrest Gump chapter, huh?
Yeah. That's
fun
what
stuff.
It was fun.
Stephen Hess, this was a treat for me. I hope it was a treat for you guys. The best part of living here is being able to just run into people like him. Anyway, Mr. Hess, congratulations. And don't forget to buy the book. We're not giving them away here at the archives, right? They are for sale. He is a for-profit enterprise. Anyway, thanks for coming.
For you to take this time and do this.